Support for the roundup comes from Symphony 3, allowing councils to connect their systems securely, to automate their data flows and to monitor performance in real time. And right now, councils are lining up for their own emergency dashboard, like the one that Symphony 3 has created for the city of Greater Bendigo. The dashboard helps keep the community safe and prepared before, during and after emergencies. It pulls together live data, including weather data, traffic data, emergency incidents, unplanned and planned disruptions, news and social media feeds. Visit www.symphony3.com to learn how you can get an emergency dashboard for your community. Hello there, Chris Eddy here with a special edition of the Local Government News Roundup, brought to you by the Victorian Local Governance Association, the national broadcaster on all things local government, and we receive support from Symphony 3, simple connected customer experiences, and Rath Engineering Development, smarter local government systems built from real on-the-ground experience. Today on the program, I'm joined by Andrew Clarke, a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of New South Wales, to discuss a timely and critical new study examining how Australian local governments are navigating the escalating homelessness crisis. While homelessness has traditionally been viewed as a state or federal responsibility, Andrew's research reveals that councils are increasingly finding themselves on the front lines as de facto service coordinators. The homelessness crisis, councils on the front line, today on the Local Government News Roundup. Andrew Clarke is a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy with the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, and he joins me now. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Good to have you here. It's pretty timely. You've just released this study that looks at how Australian local governments have been responding to the homelessness crisis. Why have you chosen to do this particular piece of research at this time?
Well, we know that local government is actually often overlooked in both research and policy around homelessness. And this is something that my colleagues and I had been noticing ourselves and hearing in our research with other stakeholders in the homelessness sector over a couple of years. And it's something we decided to so we do a project every couple of years called the Australian Homelessness Monitor. As part of that, in 2022, we first started thinking about the role of local government, only really focused on capital cities in that report. And then coming around to 2024, we decided to pitch to our funders a more dedicated focus, having a look at what local government is doing across the country. And that was supported by Council of Capital City Lord Mayors and what used to be called the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in Melbourne, now called the Greater Melbourne Foundation. And we also had in-kind support from the Australian Local Government Association, out of recognition from all of those organisations that there wasn't a lot of research knowledge around the pressures that local governments face and how local governments are responding to those pressures.
Right. And is it fair to say that you've seen over time a shifting role for local governments in Australia from being more compliance-based entities to actually being now de facto frontline service coordinators?
That's certainly what's come through in our interviews and surveys. And it does also resonate if you look back at the academic literature on responses to homelessness generally and the role of local government. It does appear that there was much more of a compliance and enforcement focus in the past. I think that, and this sort of came through in our interviews with people, that in the post-pandemic period, it's much clearer that, we're in a housing crisis, that housing issues are underpinning the stark rise in homelessness. And with that comes a sort of greater understanding and desire to do something productive in response to the problem. So that was the sense that I got that was sort of driving a change. And people we spoke to also had a very clear narrative of, this is where we're going. We're wanting to connect people to support, try and get people off the street, achieve outcomes. And with that, an awareness of the fact that compliance or enforcement responses are at best not addressing the problem, right? They're just pushing it down the road, making it another council's problem, or at worst, and the research literature suggests this is more the case, making the problem worse by actually further entrenching homelessness, further marginalising and disadvantaging people.
You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic. We often use that as a point in time, as a reference, don't we? But it's more than that here, I sense. A lot of this is actually because of the way the pandemic affected people and how it was responded to?
Yeah, I think the pandemic and the sort of subsequent impact on the housing system really accelerated and generalised the housing crisis. So there had been a housing crisis for people on lower incomes and other people who were generally vulnerable for building for some time, right? That if you look at affordability in terms of low income groups, that have been declining over several decades. So it's not necessarily a new problem for people on lower incomes. However, what we saw change with the pandemic is, number one, it became less of a problem in the kind of core capital cities where unaffordability and homelessness tended to concentrate. And this was linked to, number two, sort of changes in sort of population distribution and work patterns that came with the pandemic, right? So the pandemic, a few things, we saw all the weird stuff with like investment in housing and stuff like that, prices going up, but also people started to move to the regions. They were able to work from home or work remotely. And that saw the problem sort of spread out. And this came through in our survey findings as well.
Yeah. So the scale of the problem from a council point of view, your data shows that pretty much all councils, I think 95%, have seen an increase in 5 years. And I wonder, what's changed on the front line for councils? Are they responding more to external pressures here, or is it something else at play?
Well, let me just clarify the change in scale, because it's sort of the survey gets a bit complicated. So what we found is that it's actually 2/3 of councils now report that homelessness is a significant problem in their community, right? It's a significant problem for them. And that's up, if you look at studies, and there isn't many studies, but the few studies that exist from previous to the pandemic in the 2010s, it was only around 10%, and they were mainly capital city councils, right? So we've seen a marked increase and spread of the problem. And in our survey, the kinds of councils most likely to report that homelessness was a significant or worse problem were in capital cities and in regional cities, right? Of those councils, of those 2/3, 95% of them say that the problem has gotten worse, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And the other third don't. So, yeah.
Understand. And are we talking about all 537 councils across Australia when we talk about that catchment? Yeah.
So we sent the survey and invited contributions from all 500 and whatever councils there
37,
are. 37, thank you. But we received a response rate of around 30%. So around 30% of councils got back to us. Now, that might sound low, but it's pretty typical for surveys that we consider anything around sort of a 30, 40% mark to be, usual. And if you're getting better than that, it's really good. So,
and it's still a big number. It's still a big number of councils. So I would think statistically,
it's 160 or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. And from all states?
Yes, all states. We got responses from all states. Yeah.
So the roles that councils are playing here, despite, I guess it's not been a core function of councils, has it? But it's becoming more and more necessary for councils to respond in some way. And you've talked about 3 sort of core functions within this problem: surveillance, coordination, facilitation. Can we talk a bit about perhaps surveillance firstly, because that's an evolving space, I gather.
Yeah. So this relates to, so essentially what we did is we sort of asked councils what they were doing and tried to pick out some best practice examples or pull out some sort of generalizable functions that they were performing, right? And sometimes different councils are doing this in different ways, but we would have thought overall, what are the key ways, or if we were to come up with a typology or set of ideal types about what councils were doing. And they're those 3 that you listed. And the first one is surveillance and referral. And that relates to the fact that councils are, we call them the kind of primary custodians of the public realm, right? So when you have a problem in sort of public realm in your city or town, you typically think to call your council to deal with it. And indeed, that's what people do for homelessness, right? They will bring up their council and say, oh, there's people sleeping rough in the park down the road or whatever. Councils are also on the ground in their cities or towns more frequently than most other, well, definitely more frequently than other levels of government,
Of course.
and often more frequently than homelessness services, right? So they're more likely to be encountering people experiencing homelessness as well. Everyone from park rangers to librarians encounters people sleeping rough in their towns. So what we see councils doing is actually leveraging this, right? And saying that we know we know who is sleeping rough and where through these sources of contact, actually leveraging that to try and connect people into specialist support services. So acting as a conduit for those services. And we also interviewed local service providers. So we did 3 case studies in addition to our survey, where we went in and we spoke to people in the council about what they were doing. And we also spoke to local services about their perceptions and experience of working with the council and what was helpful and what wasn't. And they all said, those homelessness support services all said, that they found this extremely helpful. And actually, the council tended to know what was happening on the ground better than they did in many instances. In some cases, they had their own outreach. In a lot of cases, in particularly regional areas, they didn't. So actually, the council became one of the main sources of connecting them to people sleeping rough.
Yeah. There's been some media in recent times focusing on some particular councils that have taken a more, shall we say, heavy-handed approach to the issue, punitive, moving people on, etc. Did you hear from those councils, and did you get a sense of how prevalent that type of approach is?
Inconveniently, they started doing that pretty much as soon as we finished our field work. So we had this
Is that
narrative
right?
coming through of, we're moving away from compliance towards support. And then all of a sudden you see these examples popping up of these councils moving back to that kind of unproductive enforcement response. However, through our interviews and the survey we did understand, we got insights into why this was happening, even though it wasn't specific to those cases, right? So what people reported and what we've seen happening in other research we've done, and indeed research around the world, is that yes, councils want to take a more proactive and support-oriented approach. However, the problem is that both those councils and the services they're working with are reliant on this availability of housing that's accessible and affordable to those people in order to get timely outcomes, right? In a housing crisis, it's exactly the shortfall of those things that's causing homelessness is actually blocking people from exiting. So sometimes it can take a very long time and services have to work with people for an extended period to get an outcome. Now, community members might not necessarily understand that. Local businesses might not necessarily understand that. And they'll say, well, I've reported to the council. Why is this person still here? Why aren't you doing anything, right? And this pressure can build up over time on councils, and they start to get sort of the political blowback, which then they think, oh, well, we've just got to move these people on because the pressure is becoming too much. And that was actually a common story that people would say, well, enforcement's our last resort, but, we can see that councils are resorting to that more because of the frustration that services have in getting people into housing. And I dare say that's what's happening in those high-profile examples that you mentioned.
And as you said earlier, effectively moving the problem potentially onto another LGA, so it becomes their problem, and of course they might be taking a different approach. Traditionally, I guess councils use their planning levers and assets to try and deliver more so lately social housing and other sort of responses here. Did you hear much about where councils are at in that space? Because there's a lot said about the barriers to actually delivering housing as quickly as it's needed.
Yes, we did. And one of the other kind of core functions that we pulled out in our typology is what we call facilitation, right? That's facilitation of housing, accommodation, and to some extent support services. So we did speak to councils who were doing things like using council-owned land or even council-owned buildings to facilitate the delivery of services or accommodation. So in one of our case studies, the local council had actually partnered with some local service providers to develop transitional accommodation in an old council building. And then, that was about to launch. There were other cases where councils were talking about using council-owned land for social housing. And there's some discussion around social and affordable housing requirements as a condition of new developments, particularly when they're developments that are happening as a result of, an upzoning of an area. The sense that we got from that is that, this is very helpful. And again, it's appreciated by services. However, it's not going to be, and councils don't think it's going to be, the key source of the social and affordable housing that we need in order to address the housing crisis. Your listeners will no doubt be keenly aware it is the state and particularly the federal government that control most of the resources in this country in terms of tax revenues and borrowing power. And really, historically, when we've seen significant increases in social housing and public housing, as it used to exclusively be, that's come from strong investment from the federal government in particular. Delivered by the states, because the Constitution says it has to be, it's the state's responsibility to deliver housing, but the Commonwealth has played a key role, either directly funding that through grants or through loans to the states. So if we want to really see the problem shift, yes, what local governments are doing is really helpful, both in terms of facilitating homelessness services, but also, the delivery of some housing. But it really, that element of the problem has to be tackled by higher tiers of government.
Yeah, that's really well put. Before we get off the council attempts at social housing, affordable housing, etc., I'm reminded of some experiences that I've been close to where any time an idea gets floated to try and perhaps devote an asset to a social housing development or some affordable housing elements, there's often a NIMBYism that comes out of the nearby community to say, we don't want that near us. Have those themes come through in your research?
They did in bits and pieces, and we do see this coming up in research both in Australia and around the world. People often support social housing and homelessness responses in the abstract, but not when it's in their backyard. So that is an issue. We did hear from councils, and this goes not just to the provision of those to housing, but also to the issue I was talking about before in terms of people residing in public space for extended periods, where some of the councils we spoke to were saying it's actually increasingly our role to educate members of the community about housing and homelessness, what's driving these kinds of problems. So I think that could also apply here in relation to the NIMBYism you see, is that councils have the capacity to get out there and try and educate people and to work closely with state government and local services to try and, reassure people that the support is going to be there for those people that are moving in to social housing, and that any issues that come up would be dealt with swiftly.
You've talked a little, just to sort of bring this home, you've talked a little about state and federal government levers and the role that they play here, and there's limitations on what councils can do. What do you see as solutions perhaps that can be driven at the local government level that might push the needle on this issue?
So I think that the way that local governments can contribute best is through this kind of acting as a conduit or a kind of a supporter of the local service system, right? They can really augment and facilitate local service delivery responses. However, ending homelessness is not a service delivery problem. It's not really necessarily related to, that's a kind of necessary part, but it's not going to get the problem done. So I think in order for council efforts to be effective, they need to be coupled with that investment in social housing from higher tiers of government. And in fact, one of our participants, person we interviewed from the local government sector, put this really well, that said that perhaps some of the best, work that councils do, and Lord Mayors in particular do, is lobbying higher tiers of government for more social housing, right? Putting their voice out there. And I know that lots of local governments are doing this. And so I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, that advocacy role, we hear it time and time again. Sometimes it's all that councils can do because they don't control all of the levers with certain problems. And this is certainly one of those wicked problems that are being felt locally, but the solutions aren't necessarily existing at the local level, are they? Andrew, that's been really interesting, and I appreciate you unpacking that for us. For those who want a deep dive into this issue, you've published a research paper. Is it freely available?
It is freely available. Thankfully, academia is heading in the way of open access for our publications now. So you can read the full publication. It's in the Australian Journal of Social Issues, and UNSW. If you go to UNSW Newsroom, they have a short summary of the article put together by our media team. So if anyone's interested, they can have a look there.
Excellent. I'll pop the link to that in the show notes for this episode. Really appreciate you coming on the show and telling us all about that, Andrew. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
My guest today has been Andrew Clarke from UNSW, talking about the shifting role of local government in the face of Australia's housing and homelessness emergency. As Andrew noted, while councils are innovating through land facilitation and community advocacy, The ultimate solution depends on significant social housing investment from state and federal levels. You'll find links to the newsroom release and the full report in our show notes. And that's our special edition of the Local Government News Roundup for today. Thanks to our sponsors, the Victorian Local Governance Association, Symphony 3 and Rath Engineering Development. And thank you for listening. More special episodes coming away next week here from the Local Government News Roundup. Support for the Local Government News Roundup comes from Rath Engineering Development, smarter systems for local government, like Red GMS, helping councils manage gravel pits and projects, track quality, test results, blending options and haulage, and know the true cost per tonne from day one. Rath Engineering Development can give you a one-off report that uses your existing pit data to pinpoint the best gravel sources for your next resheeting program or disaster restoration works, saving your council time and money. For local government systems built from real on-the-ground experience, talk to the team at Rath Engineering Development. Head to rathed.com.au to find out more.